taken 5-6 minutes of your time.
Oh,
I'm
come
really
on.
sorry about that. But it
No,
was
I
really,
was,
but you came in and you went out. So I just took that time to get a little bit into that conversation.
I realized you were actually having wonderful conversation, and I didn't feel right that I popped in. So that's why I left. But thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for being part of the conference, part of the Mother Symposium, part of this. The insights that you bring in, I think I've really enjoyed that part. So thank you very much for being part of this. And here onwards, you are going to first talk about the symposium. That's the starting point. Then about yourself. Like I said, you know the drill. So I don't have to tell you. So that's what you have to do. And I'm out of the picture. I come in if and when you want me to come in. So please, I'll of course put up I say mediatorvikram.com. You'll find these details there, but Archana is going to tell us. Yes, Archana.
Definitely. So before I go any further, Vikram, I want to share my heartfelt gratitude for you, because this vision of World Mediation Circle, you're putting all your energy to bring people together, open up this virtual space, and create this debate and dialogue, and allow us to share our experiences and listen, learn, and grow. So I want to wish you lots of strength and good health to continue this work.
Thank you very much. I think these are the nice things that when I hear these things, then I say, okay, maybe there is something that I'm doing up there.
You are. This is very valuable space that you have created, and we are connecting with others and listening from them. So that's invaluable. So, okay, about this symposium, it is always a pleasure to talk about that. So the symposium, this is your fourth symposium, as I can see from the posts. And the focus of this symposium is on colonization, decolonization, and mediation. So I would say, borrowing from my understanding from Mediators Beyond Borders International, we are creating more peaceable world here. We are creating and holding a space to have difficult conversations, as I could literally see in last 5 minutes, about how to build local capacities of communities, professionals, parties who work with us, and mediate the conflicts with the approach which is different than the traditional structural colonized approach that's been used for last few years. And I think the symposium is bringing the international community of conflict resolution professionals to think about and develop a collective understanding to how to make better sense of what's dividing us, what's polarizing us. And I would say this symposium allows us to ask ourselves some difficult but simple questions. I would say questions such as who we are, where are we going, and in personal and professional capacity, because I think it goes hand in hand. It's not that you will be a different person as a professional. And that's why I think this space that you have created for, I would say, co-learning, gaining new insights, and building relationships. So I know that I know you, you are sitting in India, I know someone in Nigeria, I know someone in Brazil, and I know people who are working on the ground, and that's invaluable. So that's what this space is all about. So thank you for that once again.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I'd opened that website only to tell people that the schedule is available there. I won't open it now again. It's all there. You can watch, see all the links to the videos, and of course on the YouTube channel, everything is there. And of course, more than 400 videos are there. It might take an year or two for people to see it, but but please watch it. It's been really nice talking to everyone. I think we've gotten some very interesting thoughts from all over the world. I've really enjoyed all those conversations. And of course, in terms of the symposium, like you said, 4 of them, there's a chain there. It's a chain there. It's started with mediation in our culture and traditions, moved to heart, soul, and spirituality, then moved to indigenous peoples and mediation, and now to colonization, decolonization. So I thought of it as a chain so that we have these important discussions, so that I can now focus on creating and enlarging the world mediation circle. That's going to be my focus. I've given you 400 plus videos to watch. I'll keep putting it out on posts every day, one video out there. But I think that is where now on the ground is where we have to work. So Archana, that's where the focus has to be.
That is so true. Once again, I think that what you are showing us is we are all interconnected, and these topics are all interconnected. We are putting each topic under the microscope just so that we can better understand that, so that next time when we talk about something else, we can make those connections going back to the previous conversations. So I think that's really crucial.
But let me also tell you that now, in terms of the World Mediators Conference, and the next one is going to be mediation in our culture and traditions again, because now we've kind of have focused on each of those topics. Now again, they'll go back to the large one. So you have to participate. Again, the dates remain the same. 18th May to 30th June will be the World Mediators Conference, and 9th August to 30th September will be the Mediation in Our Culture and Traditions 2023. I'll put the schedule out. Please put in your date. But only thing is, sessions will be shorter. It'll be 30-minute sessions, because I want to get at least maybe 300 people in these conference things, because I think we need voices from all over. So I have normally I haven't given so much time to people. Now it's almost an year. So at least 300. Let's see how many people come in. So
wow, that sounds ambitious and very important work indeed.
Look, Archana, I managed 100 last year in that symposium, the mediation in our culture and traditions. So 300 for me is manageable. I will be able to manage it. It's just that now, in terms of reaching out, that part of it, all of you have to do. Let's reach out, find out who are those people who can give us those thoughts, which of course you have referred someone. That's how it will grow. Let's just get the right people, the good people into the fold, and let's get their thoughts. So Jim is coming up. Jim session is happening next week. He's also there. So that's the thing. You bring in someone, and the person comes in, and the whole ball keeps rolling. So 300, not a problem, Archana. So now it's about you. It's about the topic. Please.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you. I want to start with a disclaimer that I'm not an expert in this area, but because you make us really think about these things a little deeper than what we usually do. It was something that I tried to do, think deeply, and want to share my thoughts. So they might be very raw, and it may not necessarily be the best thing that people have said, but I'm trying my best. So I want to pitch this topic from my understanding of mediation as peace building. And of course, I want to begin and recognize that today is the International Day of Peace. And I know that you might have discussed it in previous sessions as well, but the way I want to approach this topic of the symposium today is from my learning from various people about what peace means, which includes some of the academics and some people on the ground, and try to connect theory with practice. So the symposium is about learning about colonization, decolonization, and mediation. So I want to start with the concept of positive peace, which was the concept introduced by Johan Galtung. And he was the first person who defined the term positive peace. And according to him, there are two components of positive peace. One is equity, and other is harmony. And these are two terms that are so close to us as mediators as well. So I think that finding some parallels there. Looking at equity, he says that it means that cooperation for two things, mutual and equal benefits. And harmony means you suffer the sufferings of others, which I take it as need for empathy and attunement of a mediator as they work with the parties. Of course, opposite to the positive peace is negative peace, which we know that is a combination of trauma and unresolved conflict. And trauma could be seen, according to Galtung, as violence of past, and way to bring peace is through reconciliation. And that goes so well with what this whole topic is all about. And before I proceed, I want to talk about the ABC triangle that he gave us as understanding how we can look at conflict. And the ABCs that he refers are: A is attitudes, B is behaviors, and C is contradictions. And when they exist, there is a conflict. So sometimes understanding the theory, we can build our understanding further in practice. So if we look at the triangle and just imagine the triangle, and if we look at the base, A is the attitude, and the examples of that could be racism, discriminatory attitudes that comes from the history of colonization, sexism, victimhood, or trauma. And then the other end of that is contradictions, which is inequality, which we are seeing so much since the pandemic, more so than before. Disputes over territory that we are seeing unfolding on the world stage as well, or the fight for resources. And all of that are the contradictions. And on the tip of the triangle is behavior, or the B, which is the violence, genocides, insurgency attacks, or discriminatory acts. So this ABC triangle, if we divide that in the middle, there are two divides in there, and it allows us to understand the conflict. One is, which is on the latent level, which is, it is there, but it's not clearly seen on the surface. If we are in mediation, we don't see that, but it's brewing within people who are sitting with you. This is how people think, and that encourages that type of conflict. And that's why I think I have heard from your previous speakers, and I would be talking about the mindset, change of the mindset, how we think that needs to change. And the upper part of the triangle is called the manifest level. It is how people act encourages conflict. And I think if the converse is true, then how people act positively would reduce the conflict as well. So trying to understand this framework allows us to understand the effects of colonization and decolonization and go to the root cause of conflict at both levels, which is at the latent level, which is untapped source of conflict when the parties are with you. And that's what we do as mediators. We try to understand, we peel the conflict onion so that we know what's happening. And then at the manifest level, we can see it with our eyes. We talk about the power imbalances existing in our processes. And it poses a lot of questions to us as mediators. How can we create safe space for our process? How can we allow the parties to feel that this process is run by a neutral? How can they be the ones driving the whole thing? So before I go into the details of that, I think I want to talk about our value system, how it develops. And obviously, our values developed from the society, our surroundings, and the colonized value system of the mediators is really a dangerous thing. And I know that you have talked about it a lot. And the danger is if we don't deliberately reflect on our own values as mediators, it is not safe for the parties, because I call it as authority obedience dynamics. And if mediator exercises their power and the parties abide, if we are evaluative and much more than that, and you talk about other processes which are more evaluative, and sometimes mediation could be run in a very different process manner. What it means to the mediation process, either consciously or unconsciously, mediators' colonized mindset can make it difficult for the parties to feel safe. And if the mediators starts talking about, oh, I have better understanding of dispute than you parties, or I know the best solution than you, the parties, and starts giving direction or exercising the authority, that's where we take away their right of self-determination. And we don't need that in mediation. So what we are talking about on this platform is trying to create a space where the parties can truly make their own decisions. And we facilitate those conversations, and that role is important. So I want to talk about the history of colonization and decolonization a little bit, because there is a concern that's usually shared that war or negative peace remains the anchor point of telling history. And that's true. The narratives that we traditionally hear about how colonization and decolonization happened is through negative peace. So let's look at it from the positive peace angle, because it's, to use the analogy used by John Paul Littridge, it's a web weaving. We're trying to weave the web, which is very complex. Colonization still continues to have effects on our lives, although colonization, the impact of colonization should have faded off. But we are asking questions: what are we doing to create this positive peace? And from that angle, if we want to know what decolonization means, it's a process of undoing or redesigning the colonial structures, mindsets, and systems. Because these colonized systems were designed to exert control over the colonized communities. And the colonial practices or the systems existed because they intentionally wanted to oppress the colonized people. And there was a power structure that was intentionally created with this intention of controlling someone. So if we are trying to create a free society and a space, the other side of the coin is decolonial practices. And that's where I think you are asking a lot of difficult questions to speakers who are participating, because we have to intentionally recognize these colonial practices and uphold the rights and powers of people who were colonized. We know that the psychological research has shown that people's values and how they make judgment depends upon their interaction with others. We learn from others if we listen deeply. And our ideology as a mediator can play a substantial role in how the conflict emerges, how people share their stories, whether it escalates or if parties can find resolution. And the bedrock of all of this is worldview, our worldview and the worldview of the participants. The communities develop their ideologies as well. They have their core beliefs, values, and emotions. So it's not only on my personal level or the party's level, but it's a lot bigger than that. It's community-based, it could be systemic. And the challenge is, once the ideologies are formed, to unlearn that as a community or even as an individual is very difficult, because it becomes an effort to first reflect and then understand what's fueling the conflict around us. And there are various institutions that still continue to reinforce the colonial agendas. The colonizers might have left, but then people in power are exercising that in a way which oppresses the others. So I think that I would like to explore a little bit as a student of law as well, if the law has potential to decolonize, and to what extent there have been efforts on international stage to use law as an instrument to decolonize, and whether we have been successful and what needs to happen. Because we need to tackle the issue of decolonization in multiple ways. And the history of recent example shows that law has played a very important role in dismantling some structures, but it's not been fully successful. And that's why we have to ask what else needs to happen to have fully successful completion of decolonization. There are lots of movements, and we as conflict resolution professionals need to know that, because is it really possible? Is it possible through the role of mediators to advocate for the processes that are safe? And can we stand in solidarity with Indigenous people, people of Global South, and people who are actually trying to challenge the structures that still remain with the colonized mindsets. There are diverse marginalized communities which have been tapping into something which is called as equity dysfunction. And there are two things which people look for when they look for foundation of full participation and self-determination. They need to feel that they belong to the process, and they need to feel that their dignity is preserved. So as mediators, I think we need to make them feel that we are consciously aware that they run the process and their dignity is being preserved. And that's where, again, I want to borrow what you have been saying all along in the previous symposium, and here is opening up hearts, mind, and spirit. I think it becomes crucial for us as mediators to going to the heart of conflict, as Ken talks about, going to the root cause of conflict, and then see what are the barriers of collaboration or even reconciliation. It's a big word. So for me, the key aspect that the mediation process has to focus is on inclusion, dignity, and belonging. So with that, I want to go back to the history of decolonization after 1945. It's important sometimes to go back to the history because that gives us context. And tell me if it is going too much deeper into that, and I'll stop and move to another aspect of it. But I want to go and explore why decolonization took place. We know that why colonization happened, and but the curiosity about decolonization plays a big role in what I know about people who participate in my process as a mediator. So I want to talk about three important things, three crucial things that happened after 1945, after the Second World War. One is, of course, colonized people were passionate for independence. I was born and brought up in India. India's independence movement proves that how people were passionate to have independence. The second thing is when the Second World War ended in 1945, European colonization or colonialism was a big factor in the war. And there were two major powers that were colonial, which is Britain and France. And actually, the colonized people played a variety of roles during this war. Some supported it, some resisted it. And as we know, India was British colony at the time. It played important role in both ways. In one way, there was an independence movement at the time led by Mahatma Gandhi, and the Congress Party gained considerable strength during 20s and 30s to gain the civil movement of getting the independence. At the same time, the Indian army units were helping the British to hold some of the war zones. One comes to mind, Egypt, because someone from my family, my husband's grandfather, was part of that unit. So understanding that bit of that history was there as well. And there was a demand of self-rule or independence from India. And the war, the Second World War, proved to be the last straw of British Raj in India. And what this war proved, that even the colonial powers could be vulnerable. And that was the time that people realized that they can define who they are and they can be themselves. And the world's map rapidly started changing. The formal colonies became independent countries and states. And actually, I want to talk about the third phenomena, which is in 1945, the United Nations was established to maintain international peace and security. And the UN, co-founded by 51 countries in 1945, grew to almost 144 member states by 1975, when the colonization effect started fading off. So after the Second World War, there was a focus on anti-colonialism on the international stage, led by the UN and the countries who participate in on that platform. If we look at the statistics, it's always interesting. When the UN was founded in 1945, 750 million people, almost a third of world's population, was living under the colonial powers. And today they are 17 non-self-governing territories, and there are fewer than 2 million people that live in that. It is still a large number, but we can see the shift that started happening. And that's why sometimes our individual understanding and organizations such as UN, what they can do is important as well. And their shortcomings are important to understand so that we don't stop there and try to find something more. The UN has its principle of self-determination. I've talked about that. UN Charter, Article 1, Sub 2 talks about the equal rights and self-determination right for people. So the efforts of decolonization accelerated after 1945. So we know that India got independence, and then was Burma, and then was Ceylon, which is Sri Lanka. And around 1950s, UK launched the process of decolonization in Africa, and lots of countries gained either peaceful or not so peaceful independence. And almost 80 former colonies gained independence after the UN was established. So it's important to understand some of the existing structures which connect ultimately to international law, and that's why I wanted to talk about a bit regarding the UN. So as a conflict resolution professional, we deal with people whose identities are shaped by such events. Many countries were colonized over a life of a generation, and it impacted how not only their worldview was developed, but how the mindset of their children and next generation. We both are post-independent generation in India, but I know that some of what we heard from or learned from our families and societies at the time of growing comes from what shaped people's worldview during colonization. And that's why the legacy sometimes that the colonizers have left lives through people's mindset. And we have to work on ourselves to understand what is that phenomena doing to people's lifestyles, their decision-making. And it is a process which is deeper down than we understand. And today, there is a lot of concern around migration, forced migration, particularly so after the pandemic. In 2020, UNHCR has said that there is a trend of displacement that continues, and almost 82.4 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide. And it would continue because there are events happening that are disturbing the public order. So when people migrate, we have talked about people carrying their own culture with them, their beliefs with them. And that keeps on changing. It impacts the country where they settle in, or the country that they have settled in impacts some of the things that how people start thinking. But as a mediator, we need to understand, I always want to talk about intersectional identities that we deal with. It's very complicated. There could be cultural values that are clashing with each other, which could be contradictory. And sometimes there could be influences which are religious, some could be systemic factors. So when we learn the impact of colonization and decolonization, it tells us how the culture of the person who is with us, what is their value, their identity is being shaped. So from that perspective, if we talk about decolonization of minds in the context of what we just heard, I want to talk about Fanon, who was actually the West Indian psychiatrist who was of French origin, and he is actually known as a very influential anti-colonial thinker of his time, particularly an African set. And whether anyone agrees with his philosophies or not. As a conflict resolution professional, I think his work um, allowed me to better understand what colonization of mind is. And he talks about a concept of shift in consciousness amongst both formerly colonized and colonizers. I thought that this concept of consciousness is very important, and it's it is important for us as a mediator, because if we say decolonization is about freedom, and if we say that mediation is a process of people having dignity in the process, it correlates with each other. But what happens is, as we talked about, colonizers left, but left the mindset with people. We need to understand what could be the effects of colonization on people. And I'm just trying to kind of summarize some of the key angles I thought are relevant for us as mediators. So colonization created hierarchy, and it was intentionally created because the subordination of colonized people was the key to continue colonization. And the systems sometimes were developed to sustain that colonization. So if we look at decolonization from perspectives of people who were colonized, such as Indigenous people or people from the global South, I think that the system also impacts people to make them vulnerable and make them marginalized. I think that it's a huge impact, may not be seen on an individual level. The parties who are with you may not really realize that, but sometimes the vulnerabilities could come from the acceptance of this hierarchical mindset that it's allowed and it can happen, and that is basically detrimental to the self-determination. Second thing is power structures. Colonization created power structures. Again, it was distribution of power with strategic intentions of making something unequal. It was intentional, again, to have imbalance, to remain in power, to continue controlling people who were being colonized. So if those power structures continue through people now who have power due to not colonization as such, but the colonized mindset that I am better than you, I am superior than you. And if the parties have unequal power within the process that they're participating as a mediator, we have to be mindful of that. Colonization changed the narrative of history. And that is important because sometimes as a mediator, we would want the parties to share their stories. What is their grievance or what is their problem? We want them to tell their stories. And traditionally, how people were colonized people were trained, their minds were trained to tell the stories or histories. It changed. And there is a lot of work done by Gurminder Bhamra, who is a professor of post-colonial and decolonial studies at University of Sussex in UK. She has written a wonderful book, Connected Sociologies. And she talks about correcting partial histories. And she poses approach that has three things: deconstruct, reconnect, and reconstruct. It might sound simple, but it's complex because we have to, she says that we have to create histories or narratives of history, not only about operation, how colonization impacted people negatively, but we also have to see where the history has overlooked some people who were intentionally kept out of the history, some positive angles, some positive aspects of people, which is more than seeing them as colonized subjects. They were people who had rich cultures, traditions, and maybe challenge some of their narratives as well. But it's important for us as a mediator to understand the parties in our mediation narrating their stories, maybe of their personal disputes, but the mindset can come from colonization, and they might come up with their stories in a way that comes from a place not being a free person, but someone who sees themselves as a subordinate of the other. So the next role of colonization was creating structures which were particularly for creating inequality of marginalization and privilege. And we still see there are various names for the privileges, and sometimes it could be class, caste, financial resources, and many other aspects of it. So we have to start recognizing the privileges or marginalization of people who are participating in the process with us. Because what colonization did is changed people identities, not only how they see themselves, but how others see them as well. And that's why I talk about intersectionality as important lens for us to look at people. It could be multiple identities that we have. It could be gender, it could be race, it could be immigration status. It could be many other things that we usually do not ask people about, but we should consciously and coming from a curious mindset, ask people, what are their identities and values? Because then as a mediator, we can empower them to participate in our process. One last important aspect of colonization I want to talk about is the effects of colonization are intergenerational. They didn't stop with the colonizers leaving the countries. There was a historic trauma. There continues to be historic trauma, particularly in Canadian context. I talked about in your previous show how the residential schools have continued the intergenerational trauma in Indigenous communities. I know that it continued to happen in India after 1947, after independence as well. So I know that I have been thinking about myself, who was born after India was free country, but still few things that I learned, I have to unlearn. And from that perspective, I wanted to examine the role of law. I was trained as a lawyer and then trained as a mediator. And I always talk about how mediation freed my spirit. And that is crucial because there are certain limits of mediation, but there are certain limits of law as well. We need to know ultimately where the right balance exists as a process to resolve the issue at hand. So we are talking about mediation and peace building, but sometimes as a lawyer, I can't stop from thinking from legal frameworks and what they could do and how they could become inclusive, because I see that what is happening as a trend in mediation world has to inform the legal frameworks as well. They have to open up the spaces and make it more inclusive, because it is interesting to see how law has been operating the world. There is the body of science, which is called a Sociology of Law. This is a field that is dedicated to studying the legal behavior of human groups, which again is a very curious aspect. As a mediator and lawyer, I wanted to think about law as a behavioral system. It's also an institution in itself as well. So law is part of the larger culture, and it was expected to control the harmful behavior of people as well. And that's why we have used law to bring equality of various types. As a mediator, I'm interested in relationships of the parties. And sometimes law is not giving me the answers that I need. How people communicate with each other, what draws them to cooperate, what is driving them, their conflict and keeping them apart from each other, what is the role of the power, is definitely a key aspect. Law does tackle with unequal distribution of power and resources if there is the trained person who understands how to deal with the power structure. And I think that there is no one thing as the law. I talked about various legal systems that exist at the same time. In Canada, we have legal systems which are multiple. We have common law and we have civil law. And before the common law and civil law, there was indigenous legal systems in place. So when we look at the colonial powers, how sometimes the movements for independence shaped the human rights, I think it is crucial to see that. And from the Indian context, for example, the Indian Constitution included the fundamental rights, it codified that. And I think those are some important milestones from legal perspective, that as we understand the world as mediators, there are structures from legal perspective, from international law, that are crucial. And there are various international instruments and conventions. I don't want to go into the details of it, but just want to give some examples. Conventions are the treaties that are legally binding agreements, but then there are two steps. One is the country has to enter into the treaty and then ratify that. So sometimes we know that some countries have accepted that as signing country as a treaty, but then they don't ratify that. So sometimes understanding the key aspects, how these conventions or various international instruments can inform us as mediators, is crucial. Talking about the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. So declarations are other types of international instruments. They are the statement of principles. And the UNDRIP itself is, it's not a convention. There is no treaty body to monitor its implementation, or if there are farmer complaints, right? So the UN has now actually directed the United Nations Human Rights Council to deal with those issues. But then the key issue is incorporation of these aspects of international law into the domestic law. And the example I want to give from Canadian perspective is the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples is now, there was a Bill C-15, which was enacted as an act, and it came into a law, which means that now the Canadian law and the federal government would implement the UNDRIP, and which means that the federal government would bring Canada's laws in line with consultation with Indigenous people into the objects of UNDRIP. So sometimes these are really important aspects for us as mediators to see what's happening on the world stage. We talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, which provided a lot of recommendations to the government. It was the largest class action settlement in the Canadian history. So I think that if we look at law as intellectual process, it applies to all aspects of our lives. And the challenge with legal system is it is very adversarial, it is retributive. And we have to look at, and I think the point that you were trying to make with the previous speaker, I was not there for the whole time, but last 5 minutes at least, is talking about restorative justice. I think the justice which does not punish, but goes beyond that, it actually finds healing and reconciliation. And I think that these are the movements happening on the world stage, and people are thinking about decolonization from the legal perspective as well. It is a long path. It's a long way to go, but it's crucial movement because that would, on one hand, motivate people to think about various ways of bringing the values that they see in mediation space to be something that is adopted by the international community as well. So I want to talk about two things and looking at it as from value system. Some simple things as what needed the decolonization movement as such to be propelled, people supporting that. And that was courage. I think people who wanted to show courage, They were aspiring for the ideal, to have a free world. They wanted to be courageous. It could be a value of people. It could be a new value of people who were colonized, to be courageous, to be assertive. And how we understand someone who is being courageous and assertive in our processes is, I think, crucial for us as mediators to see that someone is trying to break the cycle of colonization in their own mind. Communication, being assertive, capacity to honestly share what they want, what they don't want, and coming from the interest perspective. That's where I think our processes are needing to go. The biggest obstacle of assertiveness is lack of clarity about the personal values. What are our personal values as mediators, and what are the personal values of people participating? And sometimes what it means that the conversation comes to the biases. And I don't want to oversimplify the conversation, but I think sometimes we as mediators who are reflecting, but who are not there yet, we could be overconfident that we have freed ourselves from the colonized mindsets. And I want to be cautious about it. I want to be mindful about saying that, oh, I have achieved something, because it's a process and it's a continuous process. And we talk about various biases. I want to briefly touch on some, but there is one common bias which I want to talk about is egocentrism, which means that when, as a mediator, I bring the self-serving perception that I'm fair with the parties. I know that I'm giving them the equal space and creating it as a safe space. And what it does is it makes me unable to understand that other person's perspective or opinion may be different than my own. So sometimes we talk about other types of biases, but this is a cognitive bias, which is, as a mediator, I think that I come from a place of saying that, oh, the parties share the same perspective as me. And sometimes it happens if people, if they look like you, if they come from similar background like you might be complacent about or overconfident about thinking that, oh, yes, I'm doing the right thing because we are all the same. But that's not true. Our cognitive biases can actually make it challenging because we are unable to imagine that other person's perception. And if we are trying to create level playing field, then sometimes there is asymmetry in the process. It could be asymmetry from not knowing what one side knows better than other. And sometimes it could be much more than that. So if as a mediator, if we want to assess the power imbalances, we have to be cognizant that at the back of our mind, how the colonization and decolonization plays the role has to be consciously understood. And then we know that there are unconscious biases. I want to talk about identifying the colonial or economic biases. And I'm trying to club that. It is not necessarily together, but these are the biases that affect us as a mediator. Because although you want to be facilitative, transformative, not evaluative, whatever place you are coming from, how we conduct our process, it could actually go to the extreme of making someone feel unsafe. Because if we don't identify the colonial aspects into some of the behaviors. The traditional role of mediator is neutral and being impartial. And I have always questioned that as a mediator, because I believe that as a mediator, we have a duty to manage the power differential between the parties. We cannot be complacent. We do have intersectionality, intersectional identity biases. We might have to keep open mindset of people from diverse background, but our unconscious or implicit biases can kick in anytime without us knowing that. And we have to work consciously on those. It could be either race, gender, or many other types of it. Because what we need to do is, and what, again, Vikram, I want to connect this with your concept of World Mediation Circle. We are building relationships. We are building relationship amongst the mediators coming from different part of the world, but we are building relationships between the parties. We are establishing rapport between the parties. That's how we can reduce the conflict, maybe possibly build trust. So I think that the human interaction, people need to be affirmed, and what we are affirming is crucial to mindfully recognize and then say that this is what is happening. We talk about our world being complex, and we talk about SDG agenda. I usually have my SDG clip. I don't have it today, but we talk about not leaving anyone behind. And I know that there has been a big blow since the pandemic, because we are leaving people behind. And our target was by 2030, various goals would be achieved. But there is a big challenge for achieving the sustainable development goals, because what we have is not really going towards equal and just society. Our differences are actually polarizing at times, and there are stereotypes and discrimination that is really dividing people. So as a mediator, yes, we want to participate in our processes and provide services to people, but I think we have to act in a larger manner. What you're trying to create here is advocacy for the process of mediation, which frees people's mind. And I'm again going to borrow your words, is this is a conflict resolution revolution. And it's not easy. I mean, I'm trying to understand these things. I have participated in previous shows. I have watched some of the things. As you said, there are 400 shows on your website. Very hard to really catch up with what you're trying to create with the pace. But I think what you're trying to do here, and I want to be part of this, is shifting from debate to dialogue. And it's easier said than done. It's mediation is an informal process, so it has to stand on its own foundation. So I like to start from human rights principles, because I believe in people's equality, but we have to reach to the point of equity. And that is the challenge. We have to have understanding of fairness, full participation of people. And I was at a training yesterday, and then someone referenced a poem which says that the road is made by walking. So I feel that what we are doing here is walking on a road which has been explored to a certain extent, but what we are trying together is to walk on a road which has not been walked on before, trying to create something absolutely new, which would be us as mediators finding peace from within, and actually, to borrow the words from Mahatma Gandhi, is not to be affected from outside circumstances. It's not easy, but we can do it. And thank you for creating this space again, for thinking deeply about my upbringing and my personal and professional journey, and making sense of my professional world as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archana. I think you just move into just teaching. I think you, Professor Archana Medhekar, is what we need now. But the way you put it across in a nice way, I think all those things that you brought in, of course, there is lots more that we have to hear from you as we go along. But I think we've brought in interesting elements, a lot of them, which opens up the discussion, which is what the idea is. Let's just open up the discussion at this stage. That's why these are smaller, this was a smaller symposium, so that the thought process continues, and next year we get people to think about what you just said. I think it's really important what you put together. But let me just show you, because equality and equity you were talking about, I just want to show you something that today Darren was there. He's in New Zealand. He's from the UK. in his presentation. He had this there. He didn't, I mean, point it out, but this aspect of equality and equity that he had, I liked that. I mean, of course, we've seen it, which comes through, but this is what I think was also important. The other thing, Archana, in terms of terminology, we are moving to participant. We are moving away from parties. Okay, in our world mediation circle, it is not parties. It's going to be participants. So that's one thing that we have to do. But tell me, in terms of the terminology, you say you have the truth and reconciliation aspect, but why was it not honesty and reconciliation?
I think that these are really crucial things, but the idea comes from first we have to reach the point of truth. And that's once there is acknowledgement of that, that there was harm done in the past and it was causing trauma. And when we acknowledge that, then we can move to reconciliation. So I think it was, of course, honesty has to be part of it. But ultimately, where we reach is the first point is truth, and then it opens up the path for reconciliation.
Because I'm just thinking that why did it stop at truth? Why did it not go to honesty? We had an interesting discussion in the conference. I don't know whether you were able to see that. There was one topic. Andrea, who's in Ireland, she was one who suggested that topic, truth versus honesty. And it's really relevant. I mean, a lot of times we use truth and say, okay, this is truthful. I think honesty is what is required. I think finally we have to move towards the honesty part of it. But Archana, after all this, what in your mind should be the structure? Because I was talking to Valeos before that. How do you look at the structure? Because obviously we've been given a colonial structure to work in, and people are tinkering with that and somehow working. But let's just totally keep it aside. If you have to create a structure today in relation to mediation, I mean, for everything else, of course, all that discussion will happen. So how would you, what kind of structure would you really want to create?
So I think that I'm in process of understanding and thinking about a process. So I don't have the answer to this, but I can say that what I have explored so far. And I think whatever it looks like, it has to be inclusive. Number one, it has to be something that is not hierarchical. It has to allow more than, and that's why I think I appreciate you saying more than parties. There would be participants who are not only the people who are impacted by the conflict that's being discussed. There are more people who can weigh in, who could very well be the community, who could be the family member, who could be extended family, who could be friends, and who could be other types of support persons. So all have to be part of that. So I think that it has to be something which is, because we have to create, it is not creating or dismantling or throwing something which we don't like. We are creating something which could shape into having a fair, just, and people-driven process. It may look different for different people or different types of questions or conflicts being dealt with. So there is no one process that should fit all, but it has to be something which is informed by people's voices. It could be somewhere, it's very hard not to judge anyone, but it has to be a place where people will not be judged. And it has actually intrigued me to think about justice and healing. And what we have is sometimes we have legal system. It has to be a justice system, so it has to be more meaningful as well. And I think that various processes exist, and the kind of model or processes that we would think about, model probably is not a right word because it then constrict it to one. Whatever we create has to inform the other spaces on the continuum as well. Because I see these processes as semi-permeable. We should be able to hop in and hop off of the processes without hesitation. it should always be the need of the conflict that should drive the process. So I know that what you are trying to create here, and you are inviting people, and I'm grateful for that I can share my ideas. I think creative, inclusive, and free spaces to have conversations and even disagreements. And that's why I think mediation has the success of mediation has been defined differently. Even if the parties do not resolve, technically, if they don't have a settlement, when they move out of mediation process and try to explore something else, there is benefit of what happened in that discussion. They leave with better understanding of what the other party is saying. They may or may not have courage to acknowledge or accept that at that moment, maybe, but it definitely is going to touch their conscience directly or indirectly. And that is important. Sometimes what we do is we make the process about finding who is right and who is wrong. And then that process becomes sometimes driven by the powerful party, and then the other party might give up. And we don't want that. And that's why being omnipartial, what we have talked about in the past, what Ken has said, that has freed my mind. I think whatever process we would envision has to be omnipartial. We can't be passive bystanders as third-party neutrals, as a mediator as well. We have a place and we have a reason to be there because the power structures and differentials are going to continue to be there.
Well, I'm just thinking that in terms of this terminology or these concepts of neutrality, impartiality, of course, independence and confidentiality, all these aspects that have been connected to mediation, do you think there is a colonial mindset to bringing them into it? Is it something that you connected there somewhere?
There is obviously how someone conducts mediation. It itself is a challenge. And that's why I was talking about the colonial mindset. And sometimes we can think of ourselves as that we freed ourselves of that consciously, and unconscious biases or implicit biases are being kept on check. But that's not easy. But we need to have some structure, and how that looks like, whether it looks like closer to the adversarial process or goes away from that. It's again depending on the nature of the conflict. Confidentiality definitely is something that people value today more than before, or even privacy in this part of the world more than before. So people are conscious. So I think that rather than categorizing them into the subjects or topics that you just talked about, I would say I want it under a bigger umbrella of creating a safe space. Whatever those parties need, that's their need. If they need the confidentiality, they need it. If they want this to be an open conversation, that's their space, right? So can we open that up for them, and can we open our own hearts? Is the question.
No, that's the, I think that's the right approach. I think that's the way we have to put it across. Putting it into certain boundaries, I think you'll limit the whole process and the understanding of people. And then would people just stay away from the process because of the confines of the way someone has thought about the process. I think that's really, I think that's what we have to put across. But in terms of, I think, I don't know, because I've just, after, I mean, listening to this thought was coming, I think I need to do a symposium on legislation. Mediation legislation will come up now. I don't know whether it's going to come up in October or when it's coming up. But I think that part has also not been discussed separately, although it has come up in the earlier symposium, last year's symposium. I did discuss that as part of certain sessions. I think that is something which you can throw a little bit of a light here, but a more elaborate one on in the symposium when we have that. In terms of legislation, how are you looking at it? Mediation legislation.
I think that different countries are handling it differently, but as I see the things in India and Canada, India from little distance, but I'm actually connected with the community of mediators. So what I hear from them and what is happening in Canada is there is we are at a pivotal point. I think that people are thinking about benefits of creative problem solving. And there has been a movement to capture that through legislation. And part of it is coming from the, the number of cases which remain unresolved in the court system due to the pandemic challenges and even otherwise. The number of cases that cannot reach the court system, and not all cases actually need to be in the court, but people have to know that there are other processes. And that's why I think mediation seems to be more in people's minds, and how that mediation is evolving as a practice is a different discussion. But I think what the legislation for mediation is trying to capture is somehow change the mindset. Sometimes law can be instrumental in changing the local practices. So to look at it positively, it's an effort to legislate mediation so that the parties who are stuck in the adversarial process would at least try to consider other ways of resolving it, including mediation. And that's why I think court-connected mediation is playing a huge role. There are other spaces where mediation is offered and should continue to be offered, and the court-connected mediation process and the outside at some point in time has to jive well with each other. But I definitely think that it's a welcome step that the talk about mediation as a process is happening more importantly. There is more research happening. There is more data being collected. And right now, we don't know the impact of ODR, but the way I have continued to use the online dispute resolution during pandemic and post-pandemic, I think that there is a lot of potential in bringing the cost and time-effective solutions for people. I think that the importance of legislation and going into the details of it, how it should be designed and what should be the clauses and what happens in that process design is something that we need to check very carefully so that it is not replicating something absolutely adversarial. It has to keep the principles, core principles of mediation, such as parties' right of self-determination and voluntary nature has to continue to be there. But I'm actually happy that even there is a push from the legislative and from the judicial arm that mediation should become a mainstream way of problem solving.
Because I'm on the other side. I'm on the side where, again, for me, the connection of colonization and decolonization on mediation legislation, I really feel that we've still haven't got out of that mindset, the colonial mindset, in the drafting of legislation or in countries adopting it. And I'm looking at the India example. For me, mediation, when it is free from the state and the judiciary, that is the day when mediation takes off. That's my thought. I mean, that's my thought. And when you spoke about the court system, I am of that, of course, thought that this is a colonial concept that you have still continuing. Let it go. That's dispute resolution just doesn't have to happen in courts, and lawyers don't have to be involved in it. Every time some dispute resolution, even if legislation has to be drafted, you run to the judiciary and the judiciary is telling you how mediation has to be looked at. I think we're getting it wrong there. Mediation has to develop separately in terms of legislation also. The judiciary's thought process, when that has gone in, the government's thought process, if that's gone into it, that's the colonial concept, that we will tell you who has to mediate, we will tell you how to do it. In the bill that was put into parliament, luckily didn't get passed right now in our country, even the aspect of the online mediation aspect of it, there will be some regulation which will come. So basically, let's create such a complex structure around it that that person in the village whom I'm targeting doesn't understand the law, has to go to a lawyer to understand what are you what have you written, while it was supposed to be the simplest of processes that any person should have understood, and which we have right now, which is what I keep saying, that we have that legislation available to us today, but we are moving away from it. But I'm just today connecting it only with the colonization, decolonization aspect of it. So when you look at, say, a legislation in Canada, because I'm sure you haven't looked at the mediation bill here, so I won't get into that. But legislation is Canada, when you look at it, I don't know how it looks. Is you get the feeling that the colonization and the colonizers' mindset and that aspect has gone into it? I mean, how do you look at it?
So actually, the way I would focus on family mediation, which is happening in the court connected setup in Canada, frankly, it is being run pretty, I would say, independently. Although it is court connected, there is no interference from outside. There might be referral, but that's it. And at least at this point in time, it's not mandatory. So it's not like, as you said, someone asking the parties to do it, whether they want to do it or not. But it is really possible, I can say, based on what I have participated in court connected family mediations in Canada, that you can screen the parties effectively. You can, if you don't think that it is appropriate case, as a mediator, you can say that it's not appropriate case. If the parties need more supports, they can be referred to various types of community supports. As a mediator, you can do that. So I know that sometimes it feels like it's existing within the adversarial system, but if the mediation services can carve out the space for themselves, which I can see that the ones that I'm participating in are consciously doing it, keeping that independence of the mediation services, that's possible. Of course, as you said, how the legislation deals with it outside of Canada, of course, is different. But it is important that those spaces preserve mediation as self-determination space and voluntary nature, and I have seen that it's possible. So it's probably based on how the system of mediation kind of exists within that. But I have seen that it works when it works. It has to be specific efforts to make some basic principles to be recognized and stand for that. But the services that I have seen are really doing a very crucial role in Canada. And if people don't settle, that's not a problem, but at least they have heard the other side. Sometimes they would narrow the issues, and sometimes they would go back to the adversarial process and resolve there, because now they know that there is no point in fighting. So sometimes there is a different way of looking at what adversarial process and combination of mediation can offer. And there is a huge uptake. We're not talking about it today, but MEDAR as a process, which is outside of court connected program, even for private parties, is offered. Usually, the court connected programs for mediation, I would say, at least in Canada, are offered on the basis of people's income and how much they can pay. And many people who want to mediate privately may not be able to afford that. So these spaces are really creating really important offerings for parties to participate in the process other than adversarial. So I would say that there are certain good things, and how it run is probably the crucial aspect of it.
Well, I don't know. Today, of course, I'll connect it only to the colonization part of it. The fact that the judiciary is connected to mediation at all. I mean, just the fact that it's part of the court system. I still feel that this is something which you are be able to get away with. The judiciary is able to get away with it, but actually it's totally a different process. It should have been outside it. Of course, for their convenience, they're doing it. Of course, their inefficiencies, of course, that is the reason. But I'm saying that the mindset of a person, a colonized mindset that existed, and that colonized mindset and connected to dispute resolution and courts being involved in it continues. So I just want that to break, and you break it only when you make that process totally outside, totally independent. Then it becomes the people's process. Today, it is still that mind that dispute resolution happens in courts, and you've continued that. That's what's continuing with this. Okay, be it a process which is your process, but it is connected with courts in some way. So that cord has to break. I don't know. I think we just not being able to cut it for whatever reason, be it the judiciary not wanting to do it, whatever the reasons are. There are lots of reasons that I won't get into that right now. But I think that cutting has not happened. I think that's where one thing I feel that as soon as we can do it, I think that is where the mediation kind of takes off. And the fact that the flexibility, this party self-determination, nothing is there. I'll tell you how absurd it's getting. I don't know, in some parts of the world, the absurdity is that now we are going to force you to go into mediation. That's one part. Second, we will see whether you went into mediation in good faith or not. So we will have a look at what happened in the mediation, whether you actually, there was some offer given and did you accept it? Not. I mean, the places that's happening. So judiciary's involvement in that process will keep continuing to create issues because the structure is weak. You had nothing to do with it. And that continuation of it and being able to do it, I think that part of it is that colonized mindset and the colonial mindset, which when we are going to break that is, that's why the whole decolonization part of it I wanted to discuss as part of it. It was not going to be only colonization, and this is where Sarah, who's in Australia, she suggested it, and I took it from there, that both the aspects are important. So it's not just the way that the colonizer gave us, what we continued with. And this is something which I just don't know whether, because when I listen to you, I still feel that you still are able to connect it to the courts in some way because you feel that it is getting somewhere. And I'm saying we're not getting anywhere, and we won't get anywhere up till we connect it there. And up till it doesn't become a totally standalone thing with such a simple legislation where lawyers are not connected to interpret the legislation for you. You pick up a legislation, which is what we have, which is if you have, there's a link on my website also to that law that we have. The most simple law anyone can understand, process given so nicely there. The settlement agreement as good as a court decree, nothing else. We've got the perfect thing going. But no, we don't have a law in mediation. Suddenly, everyone in the country says that. So we should make such a complicated law, and in the law we will create a place for regulations and regulations. That's the colonial mindset. Let's create structures over structures. That's why we're not being able to cut off. I don't know whether how much you like it. That's why I was asking about Canada. So I think there also we are still stuck there. So I have, so and we were very progressive. I'll tell you very progressive, because our Arbitration Conciliation Act, we call it I mean, that law, it's conciliation, which is mediation. In the arbitration part also, it says the parties can settle it through mediation, conciliation, or any other method. So MedArb is part of our law, which was in 1996. It was there, it's available as something which is today everyone is talking about MedArb. 1996 we had the provisions for it. And I keep saying that you have to distinguish. That's why it's good it distinguished as mediation and conciliation, because those two things have to be different. Mediation, you stay in the arbitration and go to the arbitrator, and the arbitrator passes a consent award. Conciliation, you move out of arbitration, go into the conciliation section, and your settlement agreement is as good as a consent award. So you don't have to go back to the arbitrator. Both of those options have to be available to the people in that arbitration. You're going wrong to say we will only have one word, which is what people don't understand. Even in this country, they're not being able to understand. We want one word. How are you going to keep someone in the arbitration? He doesn't want, he wants to use the New York Convention, doesn't want to use the Singapore Convention, wants a consent award passed by the arbitrator. So the larger picture, I think, is still, but we will get into that in the mediation legislation symposium. Today, I think I think I've taken enough of your time. So
No, that's actually, see, my uh, limitation is I have not seen the legislation you're talking about, so I don't want to comment on that. But what I have seen in Canada, at least, is that we are trying to come up with creative ideas to grant access to justice. Ideally, when people can afford to have something other than litigation and outside of the court, yes, that world has to exist sometime. But what we have, how can we make it better? And how can we allow various types of things available to people where they know traditionally to go and resolve the dispute other than the judge deciding? And that is another way of looking at it. And I think if we consider that access to justice part, it's crucial to have mediation as an option available to the parties. And if it is delivered in a manner that it's required to be, as we understand it should be delivered, that is what I'm seeing is happening. So I think sometimes what you see, you believe, and that is a possibility. So hopefully that, of course, there are always better things possible, but what we are doing here in terms of court-connected family mediation, particularly, it's changing the landscape in a positive way. So I'm hoping that it could probably inform the other parts of the world that yes, it could work, and what are the challenges that didn't work.
yeah. Well,
But
interesting that that's
thank you for this conversation.
thanks a lot, Archana. Always interesting to, of course, the deeper level that you want to go into it. That's a much, I mean, which is, of course, that's what we need. So thank you very much. So your concluding remarks are done. So I'm not going to ask you to go for the
No, I'm
concluding remark.
happy.
But last day on the 30th, please drop in, and please, if you can, watch some of them, some of the sessions, so that you can come on the last day and speak about your learnings and key takeaways. That'll be nice.
Definitely, I'll be there. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you very much, Archana. See you then.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.